Hello, Nagabodhi, and I
So
hope our internet is going to hold out. I keep noticing mine's doing something strange. So if it does do something strange, it will right itself after a few
I'll improvise. I'll sing
Please
something.
do. Yeah. So, Nagabodhi, we've got this book that you've just written about Bhante or about Sangharakshita, The Boy, the Monk, the Man. Okay, and I've just been shown a copy, beautiful, with a very particular photograph on the front cover. Yes, exactly. Lovely. But him looks like he's being walked along a pavement, being interviewed by a TV crew. I think that's what it is, isn't it? That's yeah,
Radio London.
a Radio London. Okay, is that what
Yes.
it is? Okay, somewhere. So tell us, just starting from that level,
Hmm.
I'm assuming the cover and even the title was chosen quite carefully. So give us the lowdown on that one.
Yes. For quite a while we were thinking of cover designs, which we just started thinking like months before, just having the occasional conversation, Dhammarathi and I. The default position is of most books of Bhante, he's there as a monk in one way or another. And one morning, much closer to now, I woke up with this kind of aha moment of thinking, yes, but he did live as a monk for a while. But actually, what is special about Sangharakshita, what's interesting about him, and if you like, what's controversial about him, is that he wasn't defined by that. It was an important stage in his life, in his development. It was something that very much spoke to a very profound renunciate impulse that he felt. On the other hand, it didn't meet all his needs, and it wasn't an expression of everything he had to offer, which was, well, culminating in Triratna. So it just seemed really important to me that we didn't just carry on playing into the trope that Sangharakshita, monk, bald head in India, which is what, if you look at a lot of the books, most of them, that's what you get. And actually, fortunately or unfortunately, looking at the archives, Dhammarathi, Dhammamegha, and I, separately, I think, all came to the same conclusion that this was the only picture that we all agreed on. In fact, I think we all just mutually discovered we'd chosen the same picture. And it's the same thing with the title, The Boy, the Monk, the Man. As I say in the book quite early on, his life as a Buddhist and the kind of Buddhist he didn't just begin when he was a monk. His period in bed as a child at the age of 8 played just as important a part in the way he engaged with Buddhism as pretty much anything else that happened. He had quite a special childhood. One therapist, when I outlined some of the elements of his childhood, parents broke up, war broke out, destroyed his house. Just before he arrived in it, he discovered when he was 14 that he was gay, though he never used that word himself, and was confined to bed at the age of 8 for 2 years. With nothing but books because of a suspected heart condition. So those factors added up to an extraordinarily particular character formation, which is what took him into the way he engaged with Buddhism and his experience of, what can we say, his glimpse of some kind of ultimate truth. That's the kind of mind that glimpse came into. I think, this might be controversial and some people may not see it the way I do, but I think it's quite possible that his experience at the age of 16, it was special, not least because it was provoked by his reading of the Diamond Sutra, which at the age of 16 is almost ridiculous. But it was special. But what to me is most special about him is that because of the way his life, his mind, his imagination had been formed, his quality of focus, of concentration, of self-awareness, self-possession meant that he took that experience maybe a little bit more seriously than most people do. Many people have peak experiences and they may remember them and they may play an important part in their life. But I think because of Sangharakshita's childhood and the kind of mind he had by the time he was 16, that experience just ignited something to which he was faithful quite literally with every waking moment until he died. And so, yes, and a phase he passed through was to live as a monk. But then there was, in a way, a much longer phase. And he might say it was always the same phase where he lived as a Buddhist, undefined, uncharacterized by the monastic disciplines, lineage, traditions of any one Sangha, any one Nikaya. He was always himself in a very particular way. And so, yes, I think I did sort of deliberately, with that image and with that title, want to break through, in a way, an idea about Sangharakshita that doesn't necessarily help him. Because no, he doesn't correspond to the normal idea of what a monk should be in various ways in his life. I don't just mean the sex. He, as I say, he did not follow a conventional pattern of a Buddhist monk. He had the renunciate vision of a Buddhist monk for a period of his life, but there was so much more to him, more complexity. And you're wiggling and waving now. We're having fun with you, just as I'm coming to an end. I just wanted to really announce the fact that he was a bigger character and a more complex character, and a character who was kind of true to himself and formed and forming throughout the whole of his life.
Yeah. I mean, it really comes out in the book, actually, with that experience of reading the Diamond Sutra, as you say, and then how that unfolds. Yeah. So we'll come to that a bit later. I just want to carry on a little bit more. Yeah. So I was around. Actually, I will just tell you a nice story, which was I once asked Sangharakshita, like, how did you manage as a young boy to stay in bed after you'd just been this very active, fun-loving child, and then suddenly you were in bed for 2 years? How did you manage that? And he said, Saddhanandi, I think I was drugged. That was the conversation. I thought probably that's true, actually. Anyway, look, I was around you a little bit while you were writing the book, and it was an incredibly intense period for you. I think you were just like totally focused on just writing this book. And I'm aware that Sangharakshita is your teacher, so it's not a neutral topic for you at all. So I'd be just quite interested to know, did it change your relationship with Sangharakshita, or did it change you? I mean, just like what kind of process did you go through just to write it?
Well, starting there, I'm just to begin, I was commissioned to write a booklet of about 20,000 words that could, for example, be in Urgyen House at Adhisthana for visitors to pick up and walk off with. After the initial conversations we had with Dhammamegha and others from Windhorse, where they were keen that I should not avoid the controversial aspect of Sangharakshita. And as we talked, it seemed like 20,000 words was quite a tight brief to talk about his life, introduce him, and include that dimension. So by the time we finished, maybe we'd got something like 30, 40,000 words in mind, and I think for about a month, I just listened to some of Sangharakshita's talks, interviews with him that I'd done and that others had done, listened to some talks that people had done, books by him, couple about him, and in a way felt for quite a while daunted by the sheer vastness of how much there was to him, and didn't quite know where or how to start. And what happens with me sometimes when I write anything, even if it's a letter, is that somewhere about a month and a half in June 1921, I realized the first sentence and went upstairs and started writing. And then I didn't stop. And somewhere along the line, it grew to 50,000 words, 60, until it's now about 95,000 words. And I still think, I still think that it's doing a job. I think it's doing an important job. I have really tried to encapsulate, for people new to him, who and what he was and what he set out to achieve. And yes, I have along the way, not avoided, if you like, the difficult, the controversial stuff and so on, whether that's to do with his take on the Dharma and his take on how to teach it and you know, what kind of a community to do it with, and yes, okay, his personal life. So, I think I managed to do it in those 95,000. But I'm very much aware that there are other people. Paramartha, I know, is online, who was asked to write it before me. And he needs to write a book. I think it was too early for him to write that book, given the nature of his relationship with Bhante, his friendship with Bhante. But I think Subhuti, I know, has a book definitely in his mind to write. Paramartha will write. Other people, Vishwapani is writing a book. Other people are going to be filling in a lot of texture and depth as we go. As for your first question,
Sangharakshita himself's written a lot of memoirs. So how does your book add something to the shelf, as it were, from those memoirs? Like, what are you really hoping to get the reader to get from reading this book?
Well, I do want them to feel that they have got to know him as a person. And I also hope that they will come to realize, and this maybe ties in with the way you began that last question of how did my relationship with him change? I think I really started to get it more than I ever had before, just the scale of his achievement, that he not only for himself, created for himself a relationship with the Buddha and the ideal of Buddhism, but he also found ways of talking about it to himself and to others. And he also created a community. And I think that achievement, which organically kind of emerged out of his life, it wasn't that at some point he said, oh, I need to honor the three jewels, the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, in different ways. I think just because of the nature of his engagement with the Dharma, quite organically, out of his own experience, his own perceptions, and out of necessity, he developed these strands, which no other teacher that I'm aware of has done, certainly not in modern times, to create a really important synthesis of what Buddhism's about, of all its traditions, which was never necessary in these because people weren't aware of the other traditions. But to find ways of talking about that, sharing that, helping people to engage with the goal of that, and also to recognize that to do that, it was going to involve a community rooted in friendship and close, even intimate connection. In some ways, these were external things, but in other ways, they were very much expressions of his own spiritual life, which paradoxically, he lived in some ways alone a lot of the time. So I think, if there's something, there are two things I'd say. I think I developed a kind of sense of awe in the face of what he achieved, which I don't think I experienced before. I honored him and I was grateful and all the rest, but I think the more I looked and tried to empathize and understand him, the more astonished I was by the scale of his ambition, though he probably simply experienced it day by day as the next thing that needed to be done. I think, too, by virtue of recognizing those things, I really would love to be able to go back and talk to him, more intimately than I ever did, about what on earth was that like for you?
You'd have loved somebody, I think, to probably ask him that question.
Well, maybe this is where Paramartha might come in when he writes his book, or Subhuti. I mean, as I say, other people knew Sangharakshita in ways that I didn't, more deeply, more intimately, more, in terms of work. Subhuti was very close to him for years, and I was close to him, but not as close as Subhuti, and so on. These things will come out in time, along with probably more critical takes on Sangharakshita as well.
Okay, so talking about the critical takes, how relevant is it to know more about Sangharakshita? I mean, is he still relevant now after he's died, in this movement or outside the movement?
Yeah, good question. Because times are changing, we are moving on. People are getting involved in the movement who've never met him and never will. We go to Free Buddhist Audio, there are thousands of talks, and only about 150 of them by Sangharakshita. I would say it is important for now because it's still early days. I think the system of practice that he synthesized, his way of bringing together and then being able to offer in a coherent way the jewels of the treasure house of the total Buddhist tradition. He found ways of doing that in ways that were accessible and practical, which I think are very distinctive to us. I think as a community, somewhere where he did give quite a lot of talks when he talked about the 10 pillars of the movement, the 5 emphases of the movement, new points for old order members and new order members. He spent quite a lot of time pointing out what was distinctive about our movement, and so that the DNA of our movement is still Sangharakshita's achievement and his synthesis based on his experience, his critique, and his devotion. The fact that we are a Western movement, which in some ways is quite modern, nothing like as modern as some of the developments that have taken place in the last few decades. In a way, his language for trying to develop modern languages for the Dharma were evolution, Jungian psychology. Now, the new age is neuroscience, and which is extremely interesting and valuable. Sangharakshita, in a way, you could say, is being superseded. His attempt to modernize, you could say, is being superseded. But in terms of the depth of the human psyche, which he explored and challenged us with, his ways of just engaging us all in an experiment with our minds and our lives, came from a very particular take, an sense of urgency, all his own. And I don't think we're ready to do without a lot of reference to that. I mean, somebody who's getting really quite involved, of my acquaintance, and who's been on several retreats and listened to a lot of talks. When I mentioned one of Bante's lectures, and just in passing in a conversation over coffee, he said, "Oh, so do you think it's actually worth listening to those lectures?" And I found that so interesting. That's where we are now. But actually, I think, gosh, I mean, just a little story. When going back to 2003, I did an interview with Sangharakshita on video, and it's published as In Retrospect. And I did definitely want to go into his sexual activity with him. And so about 20 minutes or so of the interview went there. At the time, it was at one of those times when there'd been a little string of revelations or stories that had come out that had rocked people. And it took me quite a lot of work to persuade him to meet with me and talk about that. And I'm not sure if, in retrospect, he was that happy about it. But my main argument to him was, we're not ready to do without you. Because, I did see people kind of just on the basis of that aspect of his life, which, we can go there or not in this conversation, I don't know. But, it had rocked people, and it was sort of making some people begin to think, anyway, it's time. We've got our own teachers now. There are other good teachers in the West. That, do we need him? And I think, well, there are other teachers in the West. There are other movements, but for Triratna to retain its distinctive character and its distinctive Dharma approach, I believe we still do need to be very aware of what Sangharakshita taught and how he taught it and what his priorities were, and so on. Yeah.
As you mentioned, that his life was dogged really by this controversy and accounts of his sex life and everything like that. How did you approach that area? Because, like you said, you were asked not to avoid it. So, what was in your mind when you were doing that?
I didn't have a plan. Just following on from how what I said a minute ago about how I began. I literally began with the first sentence. I mean, I don't know how many mind maps on my computer's hard drive, but I'd hardly used any of them. I sometimes would kind of try and plan, But like I said, there's just so many threads to almost anything I opened up that I just got daunted. Maybe I'm lazy and I just don't have that kind of mind, but I kind of just followed the drift of his life. And if I bumped into the issue and it was relevant, then I dealt with it. And I suppose that means I dealt with it, you could say, from the point of view of him as a young person, just realizing he's gay. I mean, I touch on it there. I suppose I touched on it in relation to, of course, his decision once he was back in England, to let that side of himself go and have sexual relationships. So obviously, how was that? What did that mean for him? What was going on in him that he made that decision, to go there, to do that? And what had been happening before in terms of what tensions was he dealing with before that? The Sangharakshita 1-2 that he wrote about the poet and the hermit, and also you could say the sexual being and the monk. These were all tensions and energies playing out throughout a lot of his life. So that's in there. But then there's the effect it had on others and the effect it had on the movement as a whole. So there are places where I'll bump into that. And so for a page or two, I might deal with it. So I think it's not like there's one place where I just deal with it. It seemed again to be relevant to the development of his life. And I hope people will feel that I've left them free to make up their own minds. There's no question that there were people who were hurt, harmed. He came to sex as, although in his probably around the age of 40, maybe a bit younger than that, not knowing anything, totally unsocialized in that area. Homosexuality had been illegal and never mentioned when he was a young man. So, and in the army, it was certainly not something that happened. And, he was just completely naive, unsocialized, unpracticed. And I think, he admitted to me in that interview back in 2003, he made mistakes and some of them hurt people. So that's part of it. But I think in another way, and this is the thing that's difficult. This doesn't excuse or justify, but it's a really important and, if you like, exciting fact of his life, given that he was given his project of bringing the Dharma to the West, that it's really important that he allowed himself to be the person he was while still a totally committed Buddhist, and to work out what that meant. I think, yes, we're left with a tangled legacy, because of that. No question. And I doubt he didn't. I'd be very surprised if he hadn't thought about that. I think he was very disappointed and even shocked to discover that he had hurt some people as badly as he had. Not that it was many people, but there were, and it's one's enough, you could argue. But I think the fact that he allowed himself to be absolutely true to himself, and in relation to his experience of the Dharma and his experience of the project he was engaged in, I think that's quite exciting. I mean, I write about his use of the word experimentation and exploration, which really was a turn-off for a lot of people, including me at the time. And I did challenge him at the time. But I think as I was writing the book, and this is an example of the effect of writing the book, I realized just the extent to which his whole life was an experiment and an exploration. And it's in that context that you can also frame, the sexual stuff. So I say it doesn't excuse, forgive, justify, but there is also a bigger picture, and I hope I've left it to people to make up their own minds what they do with that.
We'll come to the bigger picture in a minute, but I'm just going to say that when I went in to interview him, and he was in the midst of reading everything that was on social media, and he knew what was going on around him in terms of his own controversy, as it were. And I remember him saying to me, we just sat down quietly, and I asked him how he was getting on, and it was quite he was finding some of it very difficult. And he said, what I find very painful, Saddhanandi, is that I know some people will put off the Dharma because of this. And he was more concerned about that, actually, apart from the individual hurt that people experience.
Yeah, I mean, you could, you know, I mean, it used to upset some people that when people asked him in, say, a seminar context, why did the English Sangha Trust, you know, want you to go back to India? You know, why were you rejected by that generation of Buddhists? And he would often say, I don't know, or he'd say, well, I think it was because I upset the extremists on the two sides of the big divide between the more Theravadin and Zen worlds of the English Sangha Trust and the Buddhist Society. And we'd in the coffee bar saying, in the coffee break, saying they didn't like the fact that he was homosexual and having sex. Why doesn't he say that? But I think, again, I don't think he was disingenuous, but again, having looked at his life as a whole and really sort of engaged with his life as a whole, and his practice life and his Buddhist life as, you know, as a whole, I think I've come to see that, yes, actually his Buddhist life was also extremely controversial. The choices he made to not just disappear into a monastery and accept the rule of a monastery for decades, you know, but he did. Oh, we've lost Saddhanandi, I think.
I'm sure she will come back, Nagabodhi.
I'll,
Just keep going.
I'll carry on. I think the fact that he was prepared to live among Theravadan monks and among Tibetans and to plot his own course within that. No, he did. I've heard, you know, talking to people, you know, recently, you know, that there are people who will still have this idea that he was a sort of a fake monk, that he dressed up in a monk's costume, because they don't know how to place him. And it's true that he did wear his robes, you know, way beyond the time when he was in any way officially a monk. But he had made that decision for a while, just as he introduced us to pujas and rituals, that there was a value in you know, the semiotics of manifesting as a monk to these young Brits, you know, in London, who, let's face it, knew nothing about the rules of a monk anyway. But I sometimes wonder, had he just turned up in a sports jacket and taught what he did, you know, on the basis of all the experience that he'd had hitherto, so in other words, was exactly the same person, but not wearing robes, I wonder if we would have taken to ritual, you know, to some of the important elements of practice that he wanted to pass on, or perhaps listen to what he said with the same kind of receptivity. I don't know, but I kind of think that it did make an important difference, and it was fine when he discarded it. I say in the book that he phoned me up one day when I was editing the Movements magazine, which for a few years he'd always be referred to as the then Sangharakshita, and he just said, "Look, I think we can get rid of that now. Let's just call me Sangharakshita. You know, it's been useful. I am the bridge between the old and the new, and it's been important to act as that bridge. But I think it's time now we can be confident in what and who we are." And I think in the same way, although some people, even in our order, you know, have got really quite snooty about the fact, looking back, that, oh, why did he wear his robe so long? I don't think he was pretending to be a monk. And again, back to the cover of the book, I don't think we should perpetrate that sort of idea. He was something, in a way, much, much broader than that, which doesn't invalidate the quality of his learning, because he probably had read more than most monks, certainly more broadly throughout the tradition. He might have practiced meditation more deeply than many monks, so that wasn't the issue. But yes, I think it probably helped us to take him, and therefore the tradition he was here to represent and induct us into, to initiate us into, just that little bit more seriously. Who knows? But you know, I can
certainly in your book, when I was reading your book, I was thinking, I mean, it was just very interesting, this whole business about him being asked to leave the English Sangha Trust, and you know, that famous letter that he receives, I think, on the train, and he says, you know what this means. going to start a new Buddhist movement thing. And I did think, actually, I think he was always going to start a new Buddhist movement. I can't see how he would have fitted into those particular established sort of structures. I mean, he'd been following his own instincts so strongly through those 20, 30 years of his life. And he was just continually trying to sort of dig down into the principles, like very strong questions like, why is a monastic life? Why does that make you a Buddhist? I mean, there's that gorgeous story that he tells, doesn't he, of that monk that he sees in, I was trying to tell you about it and I always forget the guy's name. That guy working in the Blitz, is it?
Tilliter, I think Tilliter.
Okay.
A Burmese monk.
Yeah, and he's not wearing his robes, which was completely against the tradition that he worked for. So from a certain point of view, he was a very bad monk because he was wearing civis because he was volunteering and digging people out of the houses that are being bombed. And then Sangharakshita would say he was not a good monk, but he was a great Buddhist, you know. And he was just playing around with that idea, which I think what comes through the book is his confidence that he's continually assessing over and over again, you know, we're being asked as Buddhists to do this. Why does that make me a Buddhist? What does it add up to? You know, I have to eat my meals like this. Why does that make me a Buddhist? I have to, wear this particular garment. Why does that make me a Buddhist? Why does it make me a good Buddhist? You know? Fantastic.
I think there's that, which is really, I think, central to the Triratna project. But going back to the beginning of what you said, could he have ever settled down in a monastery? I do speculate, given his love of reading and writing and just engaging with ideas. I mean, he told me in India over breakfast one day that if he hadn't stayed in England, he might have just lived quietly, meditating and writing books on Buddhist metaphysics and poetry. I suspect he wouldn't have. If you go back to when he was 18 and he wrote this essay for the Buddhist Society's magazine, his first published piece of writing called The Unity of Buddhism. Already at the age of 18, he's talking about Nagarjuna, Vasubandhu. I know he's obviously very familiar with the sort of Theravada world already, and already sort of addressing the West, even the modern Buddhist world in these days, saying, you can no longer just think that one tradition, you know, is the only way into the Dharma. To fully understand the Dharma, why not, you know, explore the whole tradition? This is an 18-year-old in 1918. Well, he was born in 1925, so work it out for yourself. But I think, that spirit in him that not only was wanting to explore the whole tradition because it all enriched that experience he'd had, but also he was already teaching. He was already asserting his vision of how the Dharma should be talked about. So yes,
it wasn't just that he was wanting to explore the different traditions. He actually was trying to get back to principles. Yes. That's what he's doing all the time. What are we really doing with this particular lifestyle? He's questioning lifestyles, questioning, just like looking at his own inner conflicts, as you described, you know, Sangharakshita 1, Sangharakshita 2. He's doing all of that. And he was thinking, what's the basis of the spiritual life? What do you really need to have in place to lead a spiritual life? Going right back to basics over and over again. I mean, what I loved about the book, I must say, is, you know, having, maybe 20 or 30, maybe 30 years ago, Subhuti writing that book, Sangharakshita, A New Voice in a Buddhist Tradition. And he's pursuing or following through different strands of ideas of Sangharakshita's. But in your book, what we get is that all those ideas unfolding in a person's life in the same way that it would unfold in ours, only we never think of the ideas. Yeah. But, you know, sort of lovely sense of it just throwing him back on himself over and over again. Why am I doing this? What does this mean? And that comes through very strongly in your book, which is fantastic. Yeah.
I mean, I think it's important that you mentioned Subhuti's book, you know, Sangharakshita, A New Voice in the Buddhist Tradition. I wouldn't say they're companion volumes. And as I say, Subhuti's got his own book somewhere in mind, you know, if he ever stops whizzing around the world doing amazing things. But Yeah, I think that does make a really important companion piece to my book in terms of drilling much more deeply into some of the insights and thinking that emerged out of his experience. Yeah.
And earlier you were talking about that experience you had of reading the Diamond Sutra.
Yeah.
And that's just the beginning of an unfolding process, which I found very beautiful, actually. And that comes through very much in your book. I think because you're able to truncate some of the different aspects, or what would you call it, sort of phases in his life, more than he does when he's writing in his memoirs. So you have that experience, and then just the next page we get that experience of him going to the theatre and watching that Everyman, or is it the ballet, going to the ballet?
Yes, it's no one's been able to find any mention of it, even on Google. So whatever it was, which had this very,
Yeah,
it
okay.
was
So he goes to see
ballet
something.
about grief and loss and impermanence, which had
Yeah.
really profound effect on him shortly after that experience.
Yeah, and then a year or so later, when he's in India and he goes to that government ball, poor thing, as a soldier, and he's just quite disgusted by the dance. And then he says beautifully, he says, it wasn't the people, it was a life without meaning. It was a life without meaning. And I thought, God, it's like the kind of bedrock of what's driving him for the next, the rest of his life. His sort of battle against a life without meaning, not just for himself, but for everyone on the dance floor, as it were, around him. He's thinking, I don't know, I've got something to offer. Buddhism's got something to offer. And it's a going against the life without meaning thing.
Yeah.
Fabulous.
Yeah, no, which reminds me of that verse in the Bodhicharyavatara where Shantideva kind of says, life is an extraordinary opportunity, rare, precious. What are you going to do with it?
Yeah.
It was like he held that challenge up. And I think people wonder, how were people drawn to him? Because superficially, as a human being, when you first encountered him, not particularly prepossessing, rather odd, a bit idiosyncratic speech and strange teeth back in the 60s and 70s. But you kind of knew you were in the presence of a sort of a bigger animal. I don't mean that in a sort of pejorative way. There was just something about him that was bigger, somebody who was really inhabiting their life in a way that you didn't feel comfortable around because it made you realize that you weren't. At least that was my experience. And it was difficult, and yet it was a bit, you couldn't put it down. You couldn't shake him off.
Yeah. And then he's a man with his own inner conflicts, probably like the rest of us, this like the poet and the monk thing, writing poetry and thinking, should I just be this romantic, writing poetry and reading books and stuff like that. But then he's got this big, strong, renunciant sort of aspect to him, wearing robes for a long time and then living a very disciplined life. I mean, even when he was very disciplined. Yeah.
I mean, I lived with him at Padmaloka and at Marjamaloka, and I think when we had a chat the other day, you and I honestly can say, hand on heart, I never saw him waste a minute.
Yeah.
I can remember, I can't remember what the film was, but there was quite an important and really good film I'd seen, and I was telling him about it, and he was saying, "Oh, that sounds really good." And I said, "Well, shall I get it? On video." We had this huge television for a while at Padmaloka, and he said, "Oh no, I'm too busy." And just from dawn till dusk, and that didn't preclude friendships. That was part of the routine, but you always knew that whatever he did was conscious. I never saw him doing anything accidental.
No.
In his movements and in his life, and that was not easy. I have to say, it wasn't easy to live around. And it doesn't mean to say that made all those things he did perfect. I mean, whether we talked about one thing, but on a smaller level, as Dhammamegha hasn't. Maybe, I don't know if you had to deal with this, Dhammamegha, but as director of Windhorse Publications, a book would come out, out would come, and he'd get the proof, and he'd phone me the next day and say, "I've got the book," and I'd say, "Oh, good, you happy? And he said, page 215. A real howler. I said, oh no, what? And he said, that comma on the 5th line should be a semicolon. And that was it. That would be what we got back from Bhante after publishing a new book. Though I will say, when we produced the first edition of Guide to the Buddhist Path, which was a big floppy paper,
I remember it well,
with illustrations, there was an illustration of a yabyum, a line drawing of a yabyum.
Don't go there.
An image. And Shantavira, bless his heart, who did the layouts on the computer, just to amuse himself at 2 a.m. when he was working through, just wrote yum yum under it rather than yabyum, and forgot to change it. And when the book came out and I saw this, usual phone call. I've seen the book, Nagabodhi. I said, are you happy with it? He said, yes, I am. I said, have you seen the page, whatever, 150? He said, no, I don't remember anything. So he went there, and there was this really long, extended wheeze before he exploded in laughter.
That sounds lovely. That's a nice
He
story.
did have a sense of humor. Yeah.
You did. Yeah. I remember once talking to him when he described going to see his sister when she was dying, and she was very sweet actually, and he held her hand and he said, it's Dennis, and she talked to him about it, her brother, and then she just said, I want you to know I'll be all right. Don't worry about me. And he said that was such a classic. She was very sort of, she had this very calm, sort of benign presence, and that's what came through then. And he said, I'm afraid, she took after my mother or something, but I'm afraid, or my father, I can't remember which one it was, and I took after the other one. So I said, what are you going to be like? I'm going to be going to see you on your deathbed, Bhante, and you're going to be saying, and I'll be saying, how are you doing, Sangharakshita? How are you doing, Bhante? And you'll be saying, have you checked all the shelves in the library? He said, yes, this is how it's going to be. And I said, it's not a good look, it's not a good look. Anyway, he had a very good, precise eye for everything, didn't he?
Fantastic. Well, you had a way with him, didn't you?
Well, I did have a bit of a way with him.
Yeah.
So what was it about Sangharakshita that meant he was able to set up a Buddhist movement? Because it's a massive project. I remember him once saying to a Western Buddhist teacher when she was trying to set up a Buddhist Sangha, and he said, you wouldn't want it on your worst enemy to set up a Buddhist movement.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think, I don't think he could see an alternative. I mean, for him, it wasn't enough to just write the books. I mean, there are lots of, there are famous teachers out there now because they're famous because of the meditation retreats that they offer, or they're famous because of a couple of books they've written. It's a real gems. But I think Sangharakshita had a take on the Dharma. He had a take on practice, but he couldn't see how people could take that up in any meaningful way without doing it within a community. So for him, there was no choice. That's how he saw things. It had to be something lived in common with support, with the conditions, to use a Buddhist, conditions matter. And for him, the human conditions of being with others, sharing the support when you practice, getting feedback, learning from other people's experience, having teachers on hand, close to you, and taking Gampopa's injunction that the best teacher is someone around the same level as you, and so on. And I think one thing in terms of how the movement developed, I mean, I was there from early-ish, 1970 was my first contact. So there had been a few years before that, but I mean, I sometimes wonder, if a few particular people hadn't been around, and I'd particularly single out, Lokamitra Subhuti, Dhammadinna, maybe I'm in the mix somewhere, who were around at that time in 71, 2, 3, 4, 5, that era. Maybe he was lucky that there were some people who were ready, but I think we wouldn't have been ready if he hadn't galvanized and excited us and amazed us and engaged us in practice and challenged us. And then I mean, I put it to Subhuti when I was interviewing him once on video, saying, could there be a narrative that goes something like Sangharakshita, as soon as he could, withdrew from the day-to-day running of the movement and acted as a spiritual advisor to those people who were running it. Subhuti, who'd been very close as Sangharakshita's personal secretary, said, no, I wouldn't say that at all. He really was in there having the ideas, and in his way, often so you wouldn't notice, injecting them into developments or just pruning something that didn't fit. But I think it is true that once a certain amount of energy had been generated, and I write in the book, there's a chapter devoted to the convention in January 1974, where 20 of us just sat around the walls of a room in Croydon, in Purley, Surrey, with him in an armchair, and we it's as if we almost invented the movement. I was working at the BBC and assuming I'd have a career and hopefully make films one day, and thought, being a Buddhist, even an ordained one, might be something that would go into my interview with Parkinson, But during that weekend, we all realized our lives weren't going to be like that. He fed us this. He fed us with his confidence, as somebody put it, he talked the movement into existence. He called it a movement when there were only 30 of us effectively active in the order. He still called it a movement. So I think the combination of actually what he had to offer us, what he taught us, what he challenged us into, and our willingness and our readiness, made it happen. And he just engaged with what came his way. He'd read the minutes of every meeting as the movement grew, and there were meetings of all sorts. He'd get the minutes, he'd read them all. He'd either pick up the phone or ask someone else to do it.
He was like that always. He was very, very interested in what was going on around him, and he was extremely interested in his movement, the Buddhist movement. I remember even as chair of Triratna, once a retreat finished on the Friday, and on the Saturday I had a conversation with somebody who was in Birmingham at the time, and she phoned me to tell me that Sangharakshita was already asking what happened on that retreat, because he'd already spoken to somebody from that retreat, and she'd reported something. He was coming back to me about it, and that's how fast. And that was, I don't know when, maybe in the maybe like 2009, something like that. He was still attending so strongly. Yeah.
Well, there's a story I tell, I think, in the introduction to my book that Paramartha told me, that even when he was being taken to hospital a couple of days before he died, somebody wanted to see him. And Paramartha said to Bhante, no, the doctor says that this is really quite serious, kind of meaning you need to just, and Bhante replied, well, life is serious. And, he did take things very, very seriously. But the way he engaged was not he didn't have a master plan. He talks about his again, in the book I mentioned, he wasn't at all interested in astrology, but had been told that because most of his planets were below the horizon, it meant that ideas formed themselves more in his unconscious than in his conscious mind. And he thought that was a very accurate.
And do you think that had quite an impact in the movement generally? Like this, he was very intuitive, but it's like sometimes it was hard to see what our pathway was.
There were times like that, but as I say, he tended to respond to what we did.
Yeah.
So you could call it leading from behind, though in terms of principles, practice, vision, goal, bodhisattva vision, he was, he kept that very much alive. But in terms of the day-to-day working out, he just was very attentive and very responsive to what we were doing.
Well, it's true. I remember reading, you can see this in the seminars or in the books that he's produced. And I remember there was one question answer where somebody said to him, why didn't you teach us about relaxation, deeper relaxation, like sort of some of the Buddhist movements, like Dzogchen might talk about deeper relaxation, deeper letting go. He said, I was surrounded by people that were already sort of half asleep. If I talked about deeper relaxation to them, I just didn't know what they would do, you know. And it was just very interesting. I just thought, oh God, he was very, like you say, responding to who he had in front of him. Yeah.
I'm just noticing the chat lines becoming active. Is this something that just wondering if Dharma Mega's there and whether she is going to moderate this or
Yes, they're asking for questions, Nagabodhi, so they're just posting them up, yeah. And then Dharma Mega, I'm sure, will just wave something or just cut us out when she needs to, and that's what will happen. Yeah. I'm just trying to think if there's anything else that I want to ask you. You talk actually in the book several times. You talk about him being a very intuitive teacher, and I wasn't sure if you meant he taught intuitively or whether he was always thinking of himself as a teacher or something. I just didn't know what you meant by that. Can you remember?
I wish you could quote the.
No, I can't quote it.
The phrase doesn't particularly
stand out. No, okay. Well, let's leave that.
But what I meant by that in that context, and I sadly, although I reread the book over the last couple of days, I can't remember where I said that. Yeah. I mean, in the sense that he was, in one way, he was intuitive in relation to responding to us. But there was a way in which he was also always aware that there were tape recorders running and that anything he said, you know, was going to be out there for posterity and for a bigger audience. Even on a seminar with 10 people, it was all being recorded. And he knew that in time it would be edited and published. So he was always very aware, you know, of a bigger audience behind it. At the same time, you know, maybe I think in terms of individual people, I mean, he's certainly at times I felt in conversation surprised that he saw me in ways I hadn't sort of realized, you know, that he picked up on some of the things that I was working with or some character traits.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, he told me, you know, when discussing people's readiness for ordination, people would queue up to have 20 minutes with him when he lived at Madhyamaloka or Padmaloka. And he said he just found those situations so artificial that he could tell, you know, he could tell whether someone was ready for ordination by watching the way they walked across the lawn, you know, from below his window. So, you know, that's a kind of example of his intuition. And I think I know, you know, I think I know what he meant. He was joking.
So just thinking about his teachers, I'm thinking where he got his Dharma input from. And I'm aware he didn't, as you say, he lived a lot of the time on his own. He didn't spend a lot of time with his teachers. Have you got any thoughts about that? I mean, he spent a bit more time with Dada Rinpoche. I know that's.
I mean, their friendship really took fire in 1956 during this tour that the Indian government laid on for some teachers from the border areas. So that was 10 years of pretty constant engagement with Dada Rinpoche, who definitely, I was looking at some quotes from Dada Rinpoche today, talking about Sangharakshita as, you know, a pupil. You know, so he definitely, although they were friends, he also saw Sangharakshita as a pupil. So you could say he had that kind of relationship with Dada Rinpoche for 10 years, which is actually quite a long time. He lived with Jagdish Kashyap for a few months. But no, I mean, the people who ordained him, neither of them were in a position to take him on, who gave him his Theravada ordinations. They weren't in a position to take him on. But you know, what would it have meant, you know, like looking at people in monasteries, for example? Well, I suppose having stayed in viharas in India, you know, I mean, they can be pretty crude places. I mean, you don't get, it's not like the sort of, you know, movie idea of a medieval monastery with people wandering around in silence. You know, I don't know that he would have read more, studied more, practiced more, thought more deeply had he lived under the sort of tutelage of any one teacher. You know, for a start, he wasn't going to restrict himself. And I think why he felt more at home with Tibetan teachers was because they were Triratna. You know, they honored all three phases in the development of Buddhism and were, you know, they had their own ways of being triumphalistic, but they were not perhaps quite so traditionally bound in the way that he'd found difficult in the Theravada world. I mean, this is quite a big subject, but
okay.
Yeah.
Probably got quite not quite enough time to go into it, but maybe I'm just thinking, is there anything I want you to, just as a sort of last question or something? Okay, I've got two last questions, Nagabodhi, for you. One is, I mean, oh, well, there's three actually. So was Sangharakshita an ambitious man? That's one.
Okay, I'd say in terms of his vision, he felt an extraordinary sense of urgency, and I think he felt an extraordinary sense of confidence in the Dharma as a path for himself, as well as for others. When Paramartha writes his book, he'll talk about Sangharakshita's equanimity in the face of the criticisms that came his way, and his equanimity, that at the time he died, there was a lot of controversy around him, quite openly, and yet he was quite unmoved by that. It wasn't as if he was thinking, "Oh my God, some people don't like me. I haven't managed to please everyone," no, I'm not sure that he was, but he did really care about the movement. He really wanted it.
Yeah. Okay, so going two more questions then. What was his greatest gift in terms of him as a founder?
That's really interesting. I mean, I think, and this is the thing that people might find, there are the critics, I mean, it was what he embodied. I mean, there was the way he embodied this intense engagement, in the spiritual life, And I know, if you like, there's a generation. I mean, when I was at the BBC, I worked, the people old enough will remember a series called The Long Search about the world's main religions. And I worked on the pilot program about that as an assistant editor. And after looking at a rough cut of that episode, the producer said, "Oh, I'm going to see a Buddhist tomorrow to interview him, for one of the 2 programs on Buddhism, and it was Bhante. And he said, I won't say what he said, but it was a crude reference to the fact that, this man's a homosexual and I'm going to have to watch myself. Because in those days, 72, there was still this idea that any homosexual must be, by definition, predatory on any other male. And it just seemed astonishing, because this guy knew nothing about Sangharakshita, but there was this atmosphere around him, strangely, paradoxically fostered by people's total misconception of his friendship with Terry de la Mer. But for a lot of people, Sangharakshita, they'd find it very hard to understand how I can say that he embodied, the power, the power, in a way, with which, in his way, his eccentric and totally individual way, he embodied, what it means to be a really deeply thinking, practicing, caring Buddhist. It was something that you couldn't shake off. And if we'd been able to shake it off, I suspect quite a few of us would have done, if not at the beginning, later on. I mean, it's not like I always loved him or found him easy.
You can see all the way through, he's just driven by this desire for a deeper Buddhist life, and for each wanting all of that, wanting that for all of us. Yeah. So one more question, but you're only allowed one sentence answer, Nagabodhi. Okay. Good. If Sangharakshita had been alive now, is there one question that you would like to ask him?
Oh, blast.
You're not only one. You're only allowed one sentence.
Oh. I can't answer it quickly enough for you because I know I'm running out. I mean, there probably is one, and I think I did have it a few days ago. No, I didn't sort of prepare it. It's a good question. No, I think it could be something as simple as, seriously though, Bhante, how was it for you?
Yeah, it probably is that question. That's where you started, and
Yeah.
that's probably it. That is probably where we should end. Yeah, it's very, very good. You're right. It's got a very kind of lovely quality to it. It's like, with all the projections that people had on him and the kind of views about him and everything like that. Who asked him, seriously, Bhante, seriously, Sangharakshita, what was it like for you?
Yeah.
All right then, thank you. I think Dharma Mega is going to take us into another stage. Here we go.
Saddhanandi.
Oh, thank you. Thank you both for this and your great questions, Saddhanandi. I love the way that you can that people do what you say. It's great. So we've got some questions in the chat box that I'll just bring up, and if other people still have questions, that's great. Aggie has asked, how is Sangharakshita's Buddhist doctrine seen by other Buddhist thinkers outside Triratna? Is he seen as orthodox or an off-the-wall teacher with an idiosyncratic understanding of the Dharma? And I wonder also, while you're thinking about that, just thinking about how you think the book will be received outside of Triratna.
Yeah, good. I mean, I know there are people who've made their mind up about Sangharakshita a long time ago, for whatever reason, so I'd be kind of surprised. I mean, I'd be interested to see whether it changes anyone's mind from that kind of generation, from that mindset. I don't know, we'll see. There are so many stories out there. I mean, I've got good friends from other traditions who kind of really recognize that me and Vimalachita, my wife, if we're out, sort of are a bit astonished, that we seem so sane and knowledgeable and various other things, and yet how could you be with him as your teacher? And nothing kind of, these things stick. I don't know. I mean, I think a lot of that is to do with the stories they've heard about the sects. I don't know for sure. Idiosyncratic. Well, yes. I mean, in a way, the fact that he is Triyana and always has been, that he embraces and has tried to embrace all the sort of totality of the Buddhist tradition. I mean, I think that, and while at the same time there are those who'll feel that because of things he wrote, particularly in the Survey of Buddhism, which he wrote when he was 29, that there's a highly partisan streak, an anti-Theravada streak. I mean, I think it is a sign of his youth and his experience at the time that comes across. I think, in that he tried to establish an order. I mean, for a start, that just seems, ridiculously, probably to some people, they think it's a kind of vanity exercise. How dare he? And particularly of these rather young scallywags. And I think there was an era when probably some of us didn't help. We'd turn up at conferences terribly full of ourselves. We're backing the right horse. You guys don't know what you're doing, stuck as you are in your little orthodoxies, which was all secondhand, just taken off the peg from Sangharakshita. I think, I think back in early days, we didn't help ourselves. So there is that residue in the area around Sangharakshita, I suppose. And times are changing. If you look at developments like secular Buddhism and so on, which, are taking whether it's Stephen Batchelor or someone like Sam Harris and his book Awakening, and that sort of tranche of teachers who are appearing kind of secularized, they're spiritual without being religious, and quite assertively so. And I mean, you can, and with, with the sort of, quite a strong kind of alliance with developments in the neuroscience world. So Bhante will see old hat, stuck with some kind of 18th century, 19th century idea about evolution and so on. And is he a romantic? Is he secular? Is he, what is he? I can see how all those questions are there.
But actually,
but I think he was determined. Sangharakshita had a definite sort of view of how as Buddhism moves into a new world, new cultures, then to bring the whole of it, the ritual, the devotion, the magic, as well as the down-to-earth doing of it, and an order of young scallywags, but neither monastic nor lay, again, still very much work in progress, an experiment that may or may not succeed.
But I think I know a few years ago when I was hearing reports coming back from the European Buddhist Union, when European groups were getting together, and they were just reading stuff from Triratna or trying to answer questions for themselves about what's going to happen when their founder dies, and they were just seeing what Sangharakshita set up in our movement, Triratna, and just saying he was way ahead. He understood what we really needed to do. He was way ahead of us. And we're only starting now to think in a similar sort of way. So I think there was quite a lot of respect. Maybe in terms of Aggie's question about the Buddhist doctrine, it's hard to know how to answer that, but certainly Triratna from quite a number of teachers would be looked upon as an order that's really does know something about being Buddhist, and they knew what to do with it when the founder died as well.
But I'd be fairly confident in saying that Sangharakshita's grasp of Buddhist doctrine, from whichever of the lineages, is reliable and solid. I don't. What people may find hard is the extent to which he, I think it would be hard for an outsider not to see it as an eclectic muddle, unless they really explore and take the time to see how the project worked in practice as he created our world, and which is still a work in progress on that level, as well as the sort of more social level of whether or not we'll eventually fall prey to the monk-lay divide. It could still happen. You can see why it's happened elsewhere, and so on. But I think in terms of his understanding of Theravada doctrine, and whether be it from any of the yanas, he's pretty damn knowledgeable and reliable. I mean, I think I was because I'm thinking a bit about Shantideva and the Bodhicharyavatara at the moment. I couldn't help thinking, although in working in different ways, Shantideva and Sangharakshita, they were both synthesizers. If you read the Sitya Samakaya, compendium of teachings of Shantideva's, I mean, he's read everything and creates a book, with all these teachings. But then he goes and writes the Bodhicharyavatara, this 1,000-verse poem, just evoking the whole of the spiritual life with reference to everything he's read from all the available material. And I feel a bit like Sangharakshita he's kind of a poet, except we are the poem, not, but we've lost. Adistan is very good, but it's except for the broadband.
Yeah. Maybe while we're waiting for Saddhanandi to come back, we could just mention that you and Saddhanandi both will be running a retreat at Adhisthana shortly on the Bodhicharyavatara from the 11th to the 17th of March. Welcome back, Saddhanandi.
Thank you. I'm really sorry. The internet's very bad. I don't know what's going on. Yeah.
We could move on to a question from Nibaya, and maybe it's related a little bit. Was it Sangharakshita who changed the system of meditation to the system of practice? And if so, when was that, please?
Just to, I don't know how many people know what that question refers to. There was, in about 1980, in a talk he gave, he looked at the practices that he had particularly pointed us to: the mindfulness of breathing, the metta bhavana, the contemplation of the 6 elements as aspects of our being, the sadhanas, the visualization practices associated with these figures from, if you like, the archetypal sort of realms, and just sitting. These were the sort of 5 practices that he particularly had taught, and sort of distilled as being the most useful for us. And then in a conversation with Subhuti, and I think that might be the first time, you can correct me if I'm wrong, Saddhanandi, he, in a sense, it just emerged naturally out of the conversation that you could equally apply that division of 5 into aspects of spiritual life, of integration, positive emotion, spiritual death, as he called it. You could say insight, spiritual rebirth. The sort of the imaginative, the richness, the flow of the emergent richness that is made available when we stop functioning in habit and so on, and just sitting, as in Sangharakshita's sort of take, on one level, it's just a practice for kind of just letting go of the will, of relaxing, of absorbing. On another level, you could start moving into sort of Dzogchen Mahamudra territory, where, from the other practices, you're in a position to just perhaps be with awareness and so on. So I don't know that quite a few of us hadn't kind of cottoned onto that without needing to be told that it was an obvious model, the meditations, that they did kind of reflect dimensions of spiritual life and a progression, if you like, in some respect, of a spiritual life. But yes, it was where I felt relieved when it was out in print was that it did bring, particularly with this understanding that these 5 elements of spiritual life didn't necessarily need to be seen in progressive terms, that integration included insight and insight included integration and so on. And I think it spoke against a tendency to infantilize people. People get involved with Triratna because they've just been bereaved, say. They're ready for insight. They don't need to wait till they're all day 10 years later before we sort of talk about insight with them. And I think, for me anyway, and this might be my own hobby horse, or one of my old hobby horses, it was quite a relief that this was done. I don't know, what would you say, Saddhanandi? Working at Taraloka, you might have been closer to the mechanics of that.
No, I mean, certainly we were running system of practice or system of meditation many, many years before it was sort of launched, as it were. I mean, because Bhante had used that expression in a very early lecture. And we were putting all sorts of texts underneath those different classifications. And of course, you teach the mindfulness of breathing, but you don't say mindfulness stops as soon as you leave the meditation cushion. So meditation was always practice, like the different phases of meditation was always practice in terms of it doesn't just happen in the shrine room. So for me, practice makes a complete sense. And actually, interestingly, when I started understanding the whole sort of arc, I suppose, of what we call the system of practice, I recognized it in myself through art school. Like when you're drawing and painting, and probably any kind of creative sort of stream in your life, you go through those different phases. I mean, I still remember somebody standing in front of a piece of work that I'd done, a lecturer, and saying to me, anyone who can draw like this should be drawing much, much better, and walking away. And that is like a spiritual death moment where you either have to get a grip and do something completely different, or you just carry on doing the same old, yeah. So you have to leap. I mean, it is spiritual death. And then what came out of it was several weeks later when he stood in front of it with a few guys about something else. And he said, is there any piece of work here that anyone wished they'd done? And somebody pointed to mine, and that's because I'd taken a leap. But that's like rebirth in a way. So for me, it's just a completely natural process within the creativity of a person's life.
Great.
We have a question from Raf saying, did Bhante have any thoughts about how technology could influence the continual development of the movement, an online Triratna Sangha, for example? And I wonder if we can add to that question, sort of looking now, Nagabodhi, after writing this book and sort of after Bhante's death, where we see the movement going from here in the light of his teachings. Just thought I'd throw that in.
Question.
Well, I think certainly Sangharakshita recognized that technology had helped us to be a more unified movement, by virtue of being able to, I can remember being at Ariloka in American New Hampshire, and people, the regulars, all assembled, able to have a question and answer session, a live question and answer session with him by Zoom. that sort of thing, and that it's made possible. I'm not sure. I mean, he always used a pen, and when in the early days of computers, we'd sit around the dinner table asking how much work did you lose this morning when your computer crashed? He would just sort of give us he'd have a private grin on his face. I don't suffer from that sort of thing. But no, I think he was okay with technology. I mean, I'm not sure what his feelings were about, the downside of the forums, the sort of ego effect of forums, which did affect us, though they also opened up conversations and dialogue. So I wasn't around when he commented on that. I don't know if you'd add to that bit of the question, Saddhanandi, any thoughts on that part of it, or move on to
I don't know what Sangharakshita would think, but certainly I think it makes us experience ourselves more as an international order, an international movement, which is fantastic. And I mean, it's like amazing when we were leading all these retreats online during all the COVID period, and I'd be sitting introducing a retreat, and there'd be people in Australia at 5 a.m. God, I remember this very heroic 84-year-old Dharmacharani being there, and I mean, it was 4 o'clock or 5 o'clock in the morning for her. And she was at every single session, for goodness sake, for the rest of the weekend. And it just was so inspiring. I can't see any more than that.
As for what was the next part, where's the movement going?
that was my addition. I was just thinking about, looking forward from here, having written the book and sort of being in this place of seeing the project anew.
Over the years, I've now done it 3 times at 14-year intervals on an order convention, given a talk about things I see ahead of us, challenges we might meet. The last time was about 6 years ago. Unfortunately, it was too short a talk to be, I think, of much use to anyone. But I would say now I wouldn't be the person to ask. And whether that's because of my age, but or whether it's because the world is becoming, less predictable. The Buddhist world has matured, so much around us. So the days when we could think, well, we're really not the only show in town, but we've really found something, and once you've found this is it. I mean, I wonder whether, it's not so much competition, but quite genuinely, people might, with other really interesting options, might be more likely to keep moving. I think the normative life of the 70s, 80s, 90s for most order members of living together, working together, going through the same phases and issues together, I mean, that's long past now. And so the order that, on the one hand, technology has made us closer, and I think it's really important what Saddhanandi says about being able to be on a retreat with Kamalashika or Vasantra with people from all over the world, for example. At the same time, so in a way we're closer, but in terms of the intimacy that we enjoyed at a certain size, where Sangharakshita's thinking would kind of pass through us all by sort of osmosis, and therefore quite a focus on, going back all the way to the first kind of the beginning of, I think, Saddhanandi's question about the nature of the movement. And what did Sangharakshita inject? Why should you read the book? I think, we're diffusing, and in a way that's inevitable, necessary. And how are we going to maintain the same kind of collective sense of who we are, what we are, and how we're practicing to be a coherent community that deserves to exist? I find these interesting questions, and I'm not gloomy about it, but it clearly ain't going to be what it used to be.
I think the next phase we could see more confidence, certainly reading your book, Nagabodhi, I think I began to see Sangharakshita's pathways having more integrity and more intelligence from his own, like he's processing his inner life or processing his own experience into a dharmic path, and not being caught, not by being caught by trappings, kind of Buddhist trappings, which takes a huge amount of confidence. And I think I don't see why the next 10 years couldn't see more of a blossoming of confidence actually in what we've got and what we're doing. And I think your book would have added to that.
Well, I hope so. I mean, I think the really interesting, I think the developments going on in this sort of, the Sam Harris, that sort of, and other writers, maybe the secular Buddhism piece, it's not, I don't want to say that's the competition, but I think in a sense, I think Sangharakshita really, although he could talk in psychological terms and so on, but he really did believe in the importance of plumbing the depths and not being afraid of a bit of magical thinking, but also the bodhisattva vision. I mean, I worry that the secularization, the spiritual dimension without religion, it's a really interesting development, and it's a necessary, inevitable development, and its link up with neuroscience also is really interesting. But the but for me is how do the closer aligned it becomes with neuroscience, and therefore a kind of slightly reductive approach, how do we avoid it becoming a nihilistic, how will they avoid it becoming a nihilistic exercise? Because I think the dissolution of the self within the context of the bodhisattva ideal is that when the self gives way, it gives way to this richness, the spiritual rebirth. And I think it's through, if you like, myth and religion, that's the religious aspects, that we kind of prepare ourselves. There's a great essay Sangharakshita wrote called The Flowering Bowl in one of the first books we published, that emptiness is not just emptiness. Most bleakly put, if you've ever seen the TV show True Detective, there's this extraordinary soliloquy by one of the characters at the beginning of the very first episode of the first series, which absolutely nails the nihilistic possibilities of a purely reductive neuroscientific sense of what we are, which is actually very different to the Buddhist idea of anatta. And I think our championing of the bodhicitta, the bodhisattva ideal, the possibility of something that emerges when the self goes, is really, really central to what the world needs from us.
Nagabodhi, it's that was a wonderful, I think, place to end this conversation. The time has slipped by, and in a way I like the fact that in a way that's a question for all of us, isn't it, at this point, how we take Bhante's vision and this community forward and what we do with it. And I just really wanted to thank you both for this evening's conversation and the thoughtfulness of it. And Nagabodhi also for writing a book that does allow us to think through these questions and come to our own conclusions with it. I really hope that the book kind of is part of a process of a sort of healing and re-energizing and confidence, as you say, Saddhanandi, in how we are as we go forward. So I just wanted to say thank you, and thank you to everybody who came tonight.
Yes,
it feels like
you.
there's a lot more to say, a lot more to talk about. And Dario asked a question about what you're going to be doing next, Nagabodhi. So I don't know if you want to do a one-sentence answer to that as we say goodbye now that you've done this Herculean effort of writing.
Well, as Dario lives in Stroud, I'm going to try and have a cup of coffee with him in the next few days.
There you go. Cups of coffee with Nagabodhi is what's going to happen next. Wonderful. Thank you, everybody. I hope you enjoy the book when you get there, and thank you very much for your time tonight. Take care, everyone.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you for coming.